Chapter 19, Drifting Towards Disunion. So this chapter is covering the time frame of 1854 to 1861. So 1861 is actually when the Civil War starts. So a way to remember that is in 1861, the Civil War had just begun. Glorious. So let's talk about the intro. So the intro of this chapter is giving us kind of the spark notes of the chapter, what we're going to be seeing. So in this chapter, we slowly start seeing the issue of slavery become something that's a moral issue. So anytime something is connected with morality, with religion, people are less likely to compromise on those issues or less willing to bend. So as slavery becomes less of a, you could say less of an economic, less of a political issue, as it becomes more in the realm of a moral issue, people are less likely to compromise. Okay, in this chapter, we're going to be talking a lot about bloody Kansas. So remember, in this last chapter, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed those two territories, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory, to decide for themselves if they wanted to enter as a free state or a slave state. That was the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing the states to decide if they want to enter slave or free. So we see kind of popular sovereignty go wrong into Kansas, and we see a lot of conflict in Kansas at this time between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery fractions, kind of duking it out for control of Kansas. Okay, 1857, another huge Supreme Court case we'll see is the Dred Scott case. Spoiler alert, the Dred Scott case more or less extends formal protection to slavery in all the territories of the West. So the Dred Scott case more or less kills all the compromises we've made up to this point and says that slavery is okay in all of the territories in the West, even those in the North. What? We'll get there. And then this chapter kind of ends about talking about the election of 1860, where we get President Abraham Lincoln in office, and because Abraham Lincoln had been an outspoken opponent of the expansion of slavery, we really kind of set the stage for an all-out war, the Civil War. All right, so first section, Stowe and Helper, literary incendiaries. So Stowe and Helper. So what we're going to do is talk about kind of two books in this section. The first book is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. We mentioned this book briefly during kind of the slavery chapter, but we're going to revisit it again because it made a huge political impact in the United States. So let's remind ourselves what Uncle Tom's Cabin was about. Okay, Uncle Tom's Cabin really showed the cruelty of slavery. I said that wrong. Really showed the horribleness of slavery, especially when it starts to break apart slave families. So, mothers and children being sold into different parts of the country through these slave auctions. Just really the horribleness of slavery. Let's see. Yeah, and it really kind of tugged at the heartstrings of Americans. And Stowe, her driving force behind writing this was her personal religion. Okay, remember the Second Great Awakening, this huge religious revival, really impacted Harriet Beecher Stowe, and that was really the driving force behind her writing this. She saw slavery as really a moral issue. Okay, so let's talk about the impact this made, not only in America but all over the place. Well, first thing, thousands and then millions of copies of this book were sold. It was translated into other languages. A stage play was made about this. So it was really a very popular book, or a book everyone knew about. All right, okay, so Lincoln is quoted to have said when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, so this is Lincoln talking to our friend here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. He said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." So even President Lincoln recognizes the fact that Harriet Beecher Stowe in her book Uncle Tom's Cabin really did make an impact. Okay, so Northerners, how did it impact the North? Northerners more or less now stopped enforcing the fugitive slave law. Remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had kind of more or less started that trend, but now Harriet Beecher Stowe's book is out there, Uncle Tom's Cabin's out there. Now, more or less, the fugitive slave law is dead in the water, in the North at least. And also, a lot of Northerners hadn't really been exposed to slavery. They've been in the North most of their lives on their farms doing whatever it is they do. So most of them hadn't really seen firsthand the horrors of slavery. So the horrors of slavery are kind of brought into their living rooms through this book. Okay, the South, of course, did not like this book, unsurprisingly. The South really thought it was an unfair account of slavery. They pointed out the fact that Harriet Beecher Stowe herself had never been in the Deep South. She had seen slavery a little bit once in Kentucky, but she really hadn't seen it firsthand, so the Southerners thought this was completely unfair. Yes. And then this made an impact overseas too. Okay, so a lot of people in Britain and a lot of people in France read this book. And it really, to them, to these common folks in Britain and France, it really connected the idea of slavery and cruelty to the South. So, even if their governments, even if France or Britain had wanted to enter the Civil War on the side of the South, that those governments were kind of prevented from doing that because they knew that many of their people wouldn't support that decision. So this book made a huge impact. Okay, so now let's talk about the other book in this section. The other book in this section is called The Impending Crisis of the South. This is written about 5 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was written by a man by the name of Hinton Helper. Okay? So Hinton Helper is a white North Carolina middle-class man. And really, in this book, The Impending Crisis of the South, the point he tries to make is this. He's arguing that it's actually the whites who do not own slaves who are hurt the most by the slave system. So that's his argument. He's not arguing against slavery for a religious or a moral reason. He's arguing against slavery for the economic reasons, for the reasons that they say, hey, slavery really hurts us poor white Southerners, or poor white folks in general. Okay, the book's published in the North, and of course the South hates it. The South bans it. The South has book burning parties. Guess they have a lot of free time on their hands in the South. So anyway, these two books, of course, make the South mad, but they really do make an impact. Okay. Next section, the North-South contest for Kansas. Okay, so Kansas, like I kind of hinted to earlier, is a case of popular sovereignty gone wrong. Okay, so let's talk about Kansas. Well, most newcomers to Kansas were actually there for good reasons. They came because they were looking for land. They wanted to farm. Just the typical reasons for going to a new territory. However, there were some that came to Kansas for maybe some iffy reasons. Okay? For example, we had the New England Immigrant Aid Company. And this organization, this New England Immigrant Aid Company, this organization was created to facilitate the migration of free laborers, or people who would be against the expansion of slavery, into Kansas, to prevent it from becoming a slave state. So in the end, this company, this New England Immigrant Aid Company, actually paid for about 2,000 free soilers to migrate to Kansas in order that when it came time to vote to see if Kansas was entered as a free or a slave state, in the hopes that these new immigrants would then vote for it to become a free state. All right. The South felt betrayed by this. The South had thought that through this Kansas-Nebraska Act, that Kansas for sure would have entered as a slave state. They didn't imagine for 1 minute that the possibility even of Kansas entering as a free state. So they were upset, to say the least. Okay, so this kind of issue comes to life in the 1855 election of the Territorial Congress or Legislature of Kansas. So in 1855, it comes time to elect people to kind of the Congress of the Territory of Kansas. So what happens during this election is a whole lot of people who live in Missouri, who are definitely pro-slavery, just flood across the border into Kansas and vote for these pro-slavery legislators or congressmen. Okay, so they're not moving to Kansas, they're just kind of taking a day trip to Kansas and voting. So, this becomes a problem because guess what? The legislators who are elected to this territorial Congress end up to be mostly pro-slavery folks, which is a problem because most of the people actually living in Kansas are against slavery, or against slavery at least in Kansas. So this is an issue. So the pro-slavery folks who actually technically have the legitimate government set up camp in, where did they set up camp? They set up camp at Shawnee Mission. So this Shawnee Mission is kind of the pro-slavery government headquarters. And then those free soilers who actually lived in Kansas, who felt that this election had kind of been fraud, set up their own kind of illegitimate, I can't even say it, their own illegal government in Topeka. So Kansas now kind of has these two governments, one that's pro-slavery and is actually legit, and the other one who's anti-slavery and is illegal, more or less. So things are not looking good in Kansas. So we have all of this tension building in Kansas. We have two governments set up, like not a good deal. So eventually bloodshed happens. And it happens first in a town called Lawrence. Okay? Lawrence is a free soil town. So most of the people in Lawrence are against slavery, at least in Kansas. So this kind of gang of pro-slavery folks go to Lawrence and burn down at least part of it. So we're starting to see the violence. Okay, so let's keep talking about this violence. Okay, next section, Kansas in convulsion. Okay, so we just had Lawrence being burnt down, that anti-slavery town is burnt down, and in to history steps the illustrious John Brown. Okay, so John Brown is a radical abolitionist. John Brown is up there in names like William Lloyd Garrison that we talked about. He created the Liberator, remember that guy? So John Brown is another huge name when it comes to abolitionists. Okay, so he moves himself and his rather large family from Ohio to Kansas, because Kansas is where all this slavery, anti-slavery stuff is going down. So he moves to Kansas, and he gets together a group of folks, and they actually, in kind of retaliation to the burning of Lawrence, find 5 really prominent pro-slavery guys and hack them to death. They kill them violently. Not that you could kill someone unviolently, but literally hack them to death. So John Brown murders these 5 pro-slavery folks, and now, more or less, we get Kansas kind of starting their own civil war. In fact, the violence in Kansas won't actually stop until it kind of merges with the larger civil war that will take place a number of years later. So Kansas is kind of in the Civil War. All right, well, anyway, in 1857, guess what? Kansas gets enough people together to actually apply to be a state. Okay, so as a part of the process of applying to become a state, of course, you need to come up with a constitution to present to the powers that be. So now this issue of slavery or free comes to head through writing the Constitution. So if we remember that most of the people that live in Kansas are against slavery. They want free soil, free soilers, okay? However, the legislators, or the powers that be in the government, are definitely against slavery. So what happens is, it's a little bit tricky, but what they do is the pro-slavery folks, they write something called the Lecompton Constitution. So this constitution is a proposed constitution for Kansas as it is applying for statehood. So typically, when you have a constitution, you have to approve it, or you have to get it ratified by your state first. So what happens is this constitution is brought forth to the people of Kansas, but there is a loophole in it. So this is kind of confusing, but just stick with me. So instead of voting for or against the Constitution itself, what the vote is actually voting for is they're saying, do you want this Constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, with slavery? Or do you want the Lecompton Constitution without slavery? It seems pretty straightforward, but there is a loophole in there. And the loophole is this. This Constitution is actually rigged, so slavery would be guaranteed either way in Kansas, because there is, kind of in the small print, there's a provision that said that even if Kansas voted against slavery, those slaves already in Kansas would be allowed to stay. So slave owners who had slaves already in Kansas would be allowed to keep slavery. So either way, even if you voted against slavery in this Constitution, either way, it didn't matter because of this loophole. Slavery was going to happen. So a lot of free soilers decided not even to show up. They decided not even to vote because they're like, what difference does it make? Like, because of that loophole, my vote doesn't count. There's going to be slavery in Kansas whether I like it or not. So now we kind of take this state issue to national level. Okay, newly elected Democrat President Buchanan throws his support behind the Lecompton Constitution. He's like, yeah, good job, Kansas. However, Stephen Douglas, remember, he's the little giant from Illinois who kind of pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress. Well, Stephen Douglas kind of sees that this Constitution is more or less fraud, that the people didn't actually vote for it because of this loophole. So what he does is he makes Kansas actually have a legitimate vote on this issue of slavery. And more or less now the Free Soilers get together, they actually go to the polls, and they definitely vote down, or they vote not to approve the Lecompton Constitution. So in effect, what they do is, because they don't approve a constitution, Kansas doesn't actually become a state till after, the Civil War is underway, because they couldn't solve this issue at all. So, kind of a hot mess. All right, let's keep talking. Next section, Bully Brooks and his bludgeoned. All right, things are getting interesting here. Okay, so Bleeding Kansas is what we call kind of the situation in Kansas. Kansas is more or less in a civil war. People are hacking people to death. Like I said, it's a hot mess. So this kind of issue finds its way into the Senate. So we have a senator, his name is Charles Sumner. He's from Massachusetts. So Charles Sumner is a leading abolitionist in the Senate, but he's very cold, very humorless. Like, a lot of people in the Senate just don't like him as a person. All right. So Senator Sumner is really upset about how Kansas is being handled. So he makes this speech to Congress because he's so upset. And the speech is called "The Crime Against Kansas." And in this speech, Senator Sumner is really just ripping on this issue of slavery. And he also insulted a very well-liked senator from South Carolina whose name was Andrew Butler. So Senator Sumner, this abolitionist who no one likes, makes this speech, and in this speech he insults a very well-liked senator from South Carolina. Well, things start to get interesting when fellow South Carolinian Congressman Preston Brooks decides to take matters into his own hands. Okay, so he feels Brooks, this senator from fellow congressman from South Carolina, feels like he has to get justice for Andrew Butler, the guy who was kind of dissed in Sumner's speech. So really what the thing would be to do at this time was to duel with your opponent, but however, in the South this time, dueling was only between equals. And Brooks did not feel like Sumner would be his equal. So he did, instead of challenging Sumner to a duel, Brooks decides to beat him up. Like a little dog, beats him up. So Brooks, kind of getting vengeance against Sumner for his remarks against his fellow congressman from South Carolina, Butler. Hopefully you're making sense out of this. He goes into the Senate chamber, he meaning Brooks. So Brooks is mad. He goes in the Senate chamber, finds Sumner just sitting at his desk, and Brooks takes a cane and literally beats Sumner unconscious. Like, just beats him with a cane until the cane breaks. What? Yes, this happened. Okay, so as a result, Brooks, the guy who did the beating of Sumner, resigns from the House. He resigns from Congress, but then is actually reelected later. And Southerners are really excited about this. Southerners actually start sending Brooks some canes, because of course Brooks had broken his own cane. Poor Senator Sumner, he ends up leaving office for like 3.5 years, and he takes that time to recover. He actually has to go to Europe for treatment. Like, obviously getting beaten in the head with a cane is not a wonderful thing for your health. Anyway, so it's funny because Sumner, the abolitionist from Massachusetts, who is beaten unconscious, they actually, although he's kind of out of commission, the good people of Massachusetts reelect him anyway, and his seat just stands empty because the people of Massachusetts are just mad at the South and want to make sure they remember Sumner. So we're gonna elect him even though he's completely out of it. Whatever. Okay, let's keep talking. So now the North is outraged because Sumner was attacked by this Southerner with a cane. So even more people in the North join the Republican ranks. The South is mad because the people in the North are applauding Sumner and his speech he had given. So, you could say the poor attack of Senator Sumner against Brooks could be considered, one of the first blows of the Civil War. Okay, last section for this video. It's talking about the election of 1856, and this section's called Old Buck, which is James Buchanan, versus the Pathfinder, which is Fremont. So we'll just kind of set up the election in this section. Okay, so the Democrats have their convention. They meet in Cincinnati. They decide not to renominate President Pierce, and they decide not to nominate Stephen Douglas, because both of them had been really involved in this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that was just kind of a mess. So the Democrats are trying to find someone who wasn't involved in all of this kind of chaos. So they decide to nominate James Buchanan, because James Buchanan was actually serving as American minister to London at this time. So Buchanan doesn't have his hands dirty with the Kansas-Nebraska Act because he was overseas in London taking care of business. And so, he had less enemies. So Buchanan is nominated by the Democrats. The Republicans then, this new political party that kind of formed, but gained a lot of members fairly quickly. So the Republicans are now in Philadelphia. They're meeting together to nominate their candidate. And their platform is really against the expansion of slavery into territories. Remember, the Democrats were really for more popular sovereignty, but no, the Republicans are outright saying, we don't want the expansion of slavery, period. So they decided to nominate Captain John C. Fremont. Fremont's known as kind of the pathfinder to the West. We've mentioned him in an earlier chapter when we were talking about the Mexican-American War. Fremont was kind of key in overtaking San Francisco. Fremont was also kind of known as an explorer and a surveyor. So Fremont wasn't really political, which was a good thing for the Republicans because they didn't want anyone with enemies. So they decided to nominate Fremont. Okay. So in 1856 election, however, we do have a third party. And this third party we talked about before as well. And this third party was called the American Party, but perhaps is better known by its kind of nickname, the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothing Party was really formed by a bunch of nativists or people who were against the immigration or against immigration and more or less against Catholics as well. So yeah, the American Party or the Know-Nothing Party, if you will, nominated ex-President Millard Fillmore. And, like I said, it was nativists who were alarmed at the influx of immigrants. They were anti-foreign, they were anti-Catholic. Their famous kind of phrase was, Americans must rule America. So the American Party, more or less, like every good third party does, kind of cuts into votes. So that this party actually will cut into the Republicans' votes. So yeah, this section just kind of ends by talking about, once again, there's a lot of mudslinging. Buchanan is kind of dissed because he's not married. Fremont was an illegitimate, I can't say that word. Fremont's mom wasn't married to his dad. Let's say that. So that was a big issue. So they're slinging mud back and forth. But the next video will get more into the election of 1856.